All right, I'm Chris Hodson. I'm a faculty member in the history department here at BYU, and I'm really, really happy to be able to welcome Professor Jeffers Lennox to campus today from Wesleyan University. So by way of introduction, Jeffers is, of course, a faculty member at Wesleyan. He holds undergraduate degrees from the University of Toronto and graduate degrees from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, a place I like very much, and I know he does too. And incidentally, and this is something that can tell you a lot about Jeffers, you can find all the information I'm going to tell you on his personal website under the About section. So he is a Canadian person who also does really interesting stuff in Canadian and American history. So he is the author of 2 books. The first, Homelands and Empires, came out with University of Toronto Press in 2017, I think it was. And his most recent book just came out with Yale University Press. It's a wonderful book called North of America, about the kind of joined founding of the United States and Canada in the late 18th and early 19th century. And he's going to talk to us today, I think, based on some material from that book. So with that, Jeffers.
Well, thank you, everybody. And it's not recognizing my own face, which is a problem. Sorry about this. There we go. Yeah, I'd like to thank, obviously, Professor Hodson, for the invitation, and the Kennedy Center, and especially Kelly Russell, who made getting here just absolutely seamless. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'm used to going and giving talks where you have to compete against other people giving talks. I'm not used to competing against beautiful landscape. So the fact that you're all inside, I'm honored by, having been just wowed by the mountains as I left the hotel this morning. This is the farthest west that I've given this kind of talk. I've given it several times in New England and on the Atlantic coast, and I can take for granted certain things. The revolution is just kind of there. It's all around in street names and monuments and everything else. And it's nice to be somewhere where that's not the case, where the revolution was something that happened over there. And I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence or assume anything. So I thought I'd just very quickly introduce some places, some of these exotic and foreign lands that I will be talking about, places like Nova Scotia and Quebec. And so I just very simply bring a map up here to situate us. We've got, New York City, where the coastal elite live. You've got Cape Cod, where the coastal elite live in the summer. And then if you keep driving north through the forests of Maine, the continent keeps going, and we run into what is now New Brunswick, and then here's Nova Scotia. Over here, we've got what is now Quebec and Ontario. So these places north of the rebelling states that I argue really matter in the story of the American Revolution. So what I would like to do today is look at sort of a handful, maybe 3 moments in the Revolutionary era, and explore them as a way of understanding the role of geography and borders and the way that people think about territory as fundamental to the creation of what becomes a nation. So we're going to look at a moment before the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. We will dip into Maine right around the time of independence. We'll end with what's happening right at the peace in 1783, and then a tiny little conclusion about the War of 1812, which was very confusing then, and it's equally confusing now. So I will just sort of use it to summarize some of the big things that are happening. But what I want us to pay attention to here is that maps do help make borders, and they help people sort of cast a glance at a place and understand it as a coherent whole, when it's not usually a coherent whole. It's a collection of different entities. And what maps do when we think about the American Revolution is they illustrate the limits of that revolution and the failures of the revolution. And here is where I'm trying to make a bit of an intervention in the way that the revolution is always told, right? It's the biggest success story. And that's true. It was quite successful in a number of ways, but it wasn't what patriots wanted it to be, right? It is limited in ways, and it's limited because of the existence of loyalists who wanted to stay with Britain, and equally importantly, it's limited because of the Indigenous Nations who were much more interested in protecting their own homelands than in participating in an imperial squabble. So these maps that we will look at, and I'm going to show you a number of them, do help us understand the way that colonies are transitioned into states, which then can be transitioned into a nation. But central to understanding this project is situating it as an element of settler colonialism. This is a project by which territory is transformed from indigenous homeland into colony and state and nation, with the goal of kind of eradicating most of those homelands. This is another sort of unsuccessful element of the American Revolution, the fact that indigenous nations simply don't go along with what is happening. So the three moments that I'll talk about, the first will be the Quebec Act of 1774 and its impact on the beginning of the Revolution, and in terms of the geography, the sort of impossibility of mapping the Quebec Act, which I will get into. Map makers were very familiar with using maps to demonstrate the strength of an empire and the growth of an empire. And the Quebec Act is a moment where map makers really struggled with what happens when an empire starts collapsing in on itself. That's a difficult thing to depict graphically. The second moment we'll look at in 1776 is the Watertown Treaty, which took place in what is now sort of Maine, northern Massachusetts at the time. And this is going to help us understand colonial and revolutionary spaces, both as sort of inherently indigenous spaces, but also as places that make us change our chronological approach to the revolution. We often think of the revolution as forward-looking, what's going to happen afterwards. Well, in some places in North America, the revolution is about a contested past and about what version of the past is going to win out. The third moment will be after the revolution when we look at the process of nation building using geographic textbooks. And we're going to focus on Jedediah Morse, who was a famous educator and geographer. And he had a specific vision of the United States that he wanted to share with his readers. And importantly, it is one that emphasized the need to look beyond national borders, to understand where you are in relation to other places, to help make that understanding as clear as possible. So we'll start with the Quebec Act. You don't have to read this. This is the text of the Quebec Act. It was an imperial act that was drafted and passed in 1774 and was often called the Canada Bill, just as a shorthand. And what it reflected was the desire that the British had to successfully govern French Catholics and Indigenous nations in the territory of Quebec. So this is after the 7 Years' War. Great Britain has conquered France. It now finds itself in control of about 75,000 French Catholics and tens of thousands of Indigenous nations who fall in the territory claimed by Great Britain. What the Quebec Act does specifically is it expands the territory of Quebec. It makes Quebec stretch into the Mississippi Valley, the Ohio, the Great Lakes, and the purpose of it is so that these places that had been sort of on the fringes of New France and Canada now have a territory and laws. Importantly, they have British laws to help govern these regions. But the Quebec Act also does a few things to accommodate its population. So it enshrines for the French population their rights to language, so they can keep speaking French, their rights to the Catholic faith, which becomes recognized, and their rights to their own particular civil law, which is different than English civil law and is important to the sort of French Catholic culture. Not surprisingly, this this act angers a lot of English settlers in North America. They had just fought the war, the 7 Years' War. And the purpose of that war was to claim all of this territory for Great Britain because they wanted to move into it. They wanted to benefit from its natural resources. New England is getting crowded. People want more space. Great Britain, when it ends up securing this territory, creates this act which then makes this territory at least partially French and Catholic. And consequently, this angers so many of the patriots who wanted to move, but certainly do not want to move if it's going to be a French and Catholic place. This is also a challenge for map makers. How do they map this growth of an imperial territory when that growth is, in fact, seems almost contradictory to the imperial project? So we can look at a map maker, Ezra Stiles here, a Yale. This is what they all looked like at the time. He was interested in how this act was going to impact what the patriots eventually would want to do. And he writes about the act when he reads about it in 1774. So in his diary he says, "The king has signed the Quebec Act, extending that province to the Ohio and Mississippi and comprehending nearly 2/3 of the territory of English America, and establishing the Romish Church and idolatry all over that space." Stiles was astonished that leading imperial figures should expressly establish popery over 3/4 of the empire. Now, around the same time that he makes this diary entry, he drafts a quick map, which he titles The Bloody Church. And as you can see, this is a map that's meant to make an argument, right? The maps are not inherently reflections of reality. You use them to advance a thesis. And so he has here sort of this blood-red Quebec that is threatening and drowning the calmer and green Protestant colonies. And he's left little comments throughout the map. And he sees religion here as a border. So in the Quebec part, the red part, he has written, "Idolatry and the Church of Rome established by act of a Protestant parliament, and the voice of the English Protestant bishops to restrain and suppress the spreading of the damn Presbyterians, as they are politely called." Stiles was a very religious person, and as you can't make it up, but he strikes out damn. He has second thoughts whether he wants to have that word on the map. But he's angry. And his anger is shared by others around him. He records in his diary just a little bit later, he starts seeing parades of protesters going by with effigies. And so they're carrying these effigies. And the effigies are 3 popes, including leading imperial figures like Lord North and Hutchinson and General Gage. And then they're all burned in the evening. And he's happy to see this. He understands that people are angry about what's happening. So after seeing, fire becomes this way that Protestants look at Catholics and relate Catholics to the devil and satanic worship. And John Adams also takes this theme of fire when he's giving a speech that he reads after the passage of the Quebec Act. And I found his notes for this speech, and it's almost, the notes read better if you think of it as a poem. So I'm just going to read the notes, and it's Adams, he knew how to write. So here's what he had prepared for his notes. It says, "Proof of depth of ability and wickedness of heart. Precedent, Lord's refusal of perpetual imprisonment. Prerogative to give any government to a conquered people. Romish religion, feudal government, union of feudal law and Romish superstition. Knights of Malta, orders of military monks, Goths and Vandals, overthrew the Roman Empire, danger to us all, a house on fire." So I don't even know what the whole speech sounded like, but he obviously is angry about what's happening and has a very specific response to it. The public also had a response to the passage of the Quebec Act. We have a very vibrant colonial press at the time. And the responses to the Quebec Act do start outlining some of the cracks in the imperial system. In 1774, the Pennsylvania Gazette, this is Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, the most sort of popular in the time, publishes a summary of the Quebec Act and then also publishes responses to its summary. And one response is, it reads, "As the spirit of liberty in some of our colonies has given so much trouble to the government, it was resolved to cherish the spirit of slavery in others." And here we have another theme that patriots start using without a hint of social recognition. Right? They always say, we're being treated like slaves. You are enslaving us. How could you possibly enslave us? They never say, we're holding actual slaves. We don't ask them about what it's like. But this is the sort of metaphor and language that they are using. Map makers have a similarly difficult time with the Quebec Act. Map makers they don't make a whole lot of money on maps, usually. But when wars are happening or when empires are growing, that's their opportunity to produce maps that people are going to want to buy. The Quebec Act poses a real challenge because this is about limiting the growth of an empire. And map makers realize this. They know that the Quebec Act is going to prevent people from spreading into western parts of the United States. And this is a sort of a direct purpose of the Quebec Act. And Lord Dartmouth, one of the imperial leaders at the time, knew what the Quebec Act would do. And in his mind, it protects Britain's Indigenous allies. What they don't want are a whole bunch of settlers pushing into the West and then igniting new conflict with Indigenous nations, because that's very expensive. So Dartmouth wrote of the Quebec Act, "If it is not wished that British subjects should settle that country, nothing can more effectually tend to discourage such attempts." He knows that New England Congregationalists are not going to want to live with French Catholics and live in a part of North America where French laws and French language and religion are protected. So then what do map makers do in this instance? Well, they struggle. Part of the struggle is the Quebec Act is passed in 1774, violence breaks out in 1775, and then we have the revolution happening. So there's not a huge window for map makers to cash in on what is happening. But the maps that do exist, that were published around this time, demonstrate the challenges of charting this kind of imperial friction. So here's a map from 1776. It was by Robert Sayre and John Bennett, and it is published as part of Thomas Jeffries' American Atlas. Thomas Jeffries was the most famous British map maker at the time. It's kind of hard to tell here, but the map includes the old borders of Quebec. So you can see the orange line. That was what Quebec was when Great Britain conquered it. When this map is published, this is the border that exists. Now, Jeffries can be forgiven for this. He died in 1771, so he was not able to update the boundaries as they grew, but this is the map that ends up getting published in 1776. This is another map, again published by Robert Sayre and John Bennett, called The Theater of War in North America. And this is one of these maps that's also supposed to teach you a whole lot about what's going on. So you've got the top right, I think those are distances from place to place. They've got descriptions of colonies, and then obviously a fairly detailed map in and of itself. This map includes both borders, the new borders and the old border for Quebec. And it sort of equivocates on this imperial disintegration and leaves it up to the reader to decide which version of Quebec they should consider at the time. And here we have a map. This is William Thaden's map from 1777, which is the British colonies in North America. He published this map with Thomas Jeffries' son, who, much to the frustration of people who study this stuff, is also named Thomas Jeffries. And this map raises questions, a lot of questions, about the limits of imperial cartography. It does a good job of showing how big Quebec had become, so you can see that mass of Quebec. But this is published in 1777, and it actually depicts harmony rather than war. The coloring of the loyal provinces and the rebel states are sort of interchangeable. So Nova Scotia is pink, but so is Georgia. The green appears sort of the same tone in each place. And the cartouche itself, this little drawing at the bottom, is a depiction of sort of peaceful commerce and not of imperial conflict. So the changing boundaries in the 1770s pitted the empire against its subjects in ways that no map could really paper over. The Quebec Act ostensibly expanded British control over a primarily Indigenous territory by extending French law. And who can map that? British cartographers and geographers, many of whom had made careers on mapping the growth of empire in North America, could not chart the internal divisions that signaled imperial tension. As the Quebec Act and reactions to it demonstrate, maps could both make and unmake these kinds of empires. So the Quebec Act is central to this revolutionary process. It actually becomes a rallying cry for a lot of patriots and helps increase their anger against Great Britain in the years before the actual outbreak of the colony, or of the revolution. Quebec itself, however, becomes sort of a standard object of interest during the revolution. And just as a quick aside, I'm not going to get into this, but I'm happy to answer questions. The first thing that the Patriots do is try to win Quebec. They send letters from Congress inviting Quebec to join. They send 2 sort of friendly letters, and then they send a 3rd letter saying, hey, you guys aren't listening, so we're just going to invade you. Spreading democracy as sort of a tenet of American ideology is baked into the revolution. And that's sort of a primary story of what's happening in the revolution. But what I'd like to look at for now is a little bit farther in the Northeast, where loyal rebel colonies, or loyal and rebel colonies, face off in what is now northern Maine, but which was and is truly an indigenous place. And so here is a map from 1775. This is another one by Thomas Jeffries. This is sort of just a quick cutout from this map. And what you recognize, if you take a little bit of time, is you see indigenous names, right? Mi'kma'ki, Cape Sable Indians, Abenaki, Kennebec, battling with the colonial names, right? This is a place where it's impossible for geographers to ignore the presence and strength of these indigenous nations. And so while delegates in Philadelphia are discussing separating from Great Britain, in the region known to Americans at the time as Eastern Maine, the revolution was fought over this contested past rather than an independent future. Inhabitants of these small settler villages between the Penobscot and St. John rivers were oriented kind of equally, looking north to Halifax or south to Boston. They were pulled in both directions. For these settlers, their enemies were equally British naval ships, American militiamen, indigenous warriors, and colonial promoters. But for the Patriots, it was the warriors who were the biggest worry. There was a push for Congress to invade Nova Scotia. They thought that might be one way to do this, but that ends up not really going anywhere. And if they're not willing to invade Nova Scotia, they were certainly concerned with protecting eastern Massachusetts. And to do so, Patriot officials courted the region's indigenous population. So this territory we can kind of define loosely as Wabanachia. And the Wabanaki are this loose confederacy of indigenous nations living in the region. And this is territory into which both the British and the Patriots want to expand. And it's thinly populated by settlers who know very well how vulnerable they were to attacks from indigenous warriors and British forces. Settlers had been trying to push east from Massachusetts for over a century, and they regularly met resistance from the Wabanaki. A letter to the Eastern Indians, which was sort of a colonial term for this group, this collection of indigenous nations, was sent from the Provincial Congress in May of 1775 and attempted to alert the indigenous nations to the great wickedness of the British. And here we see, you can kind of get the sense of the power of Indigenous nations, because colonial people use Indigenous diplomatic terms to engage in discussions with them. So they address, this colonial letter addresses the Wabanaki as brothers, and the letter claims that the great ministry of Great Britain, having laid deep plots to take away our liberty and your liberty. And according to the letter, the British would deny colonists and the Wabanaki alike the guns and powder necessary to kill game and to collect skins for trade, and would make colonists and Indigenous peoples their servants. And here the letter says, our liberty and your liberty is the same. We are brothers, and what is for our good is for your good. So patriots are hoping to identify sort of a common cause with the Wabanaki, and that common cause is the British. So in July of 1776, just as the Declaration of Independence is announced, 10 delegates from some of these groups, so the Wallstuckwiak, the Passamaquoddy, and the Mi'kmaq, all of whom are members of this Wabanaki Confederacy, they arrive in Boston in response to these letters that they have received from George Washington and the Massachusetts court. About a year earlier, in late 1775, Washington had held meetings with the Wabanaki and Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Six Nations delegates. And these meetings were really because the Indigenous delegates wanted to know more about the war with Britain, figure out what was going on, and hopefully negotiate a better position for themselves as a result of this conflict. So when the Wabanaki chiefs return to Watertown in the summer of 1776, they bring evidence of their relationship with both the British and the Patriots. The conference at Watertown, which was held at the Meeting House, included the Council of the Massachusetts Bay, including its president, James Bowdoin, and 10 Indigenous delegates, including the Wallstuckwiak chiefs Ambroise Saint-Aubin, who spoke on behalf of the delegates, and another Indigenous delegate named Pierre Thomas. So when these delegates are asked at the beginning of the conference to prove that they represent nations from the St. John River area and Nova Scotia, Ambroise presents a copy of the 1760 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Great Britain and the Wallstuckwiak and Passamaquoddy. The Wabanaki had a long treaty relationship with the British. They never surrendered their territory or their sovereignty. They entered into treaties of peace and friendship that are still legally binding to this day. So in Nova Scotia, that is all still Mi'kmaq. There has never been a legal title change to the land. So these treaties demonstrate this important relationship. He also presents a letter that he received from George Washington, sent that previous February, and the other letter from the Massachusetts General Court. And he says, these letters are the reasons. This is why we are here. The outbreak of the revolution offered them a possibility to have sort of a new alliance with the Patriots, and some chiefs took this as an opportunity to assert their economic and military independence. After presenting his documents to the council, Ambroise speaks through an interpreter on behalf of the chiefs and makes clear that their desire is to ally with the colonists. He says, the captains that are come up with me and all our people are all one as Boston. They use Boston just sort of as a short term for New England. So the Watertown Conference points to the region's contested past and the power of its indigenous inhabitants. Although the Wabanaki delegates expressed their desire to support the Patriots, these meetings were sort of a beginning and not an end of this diplomatic process. Ambroise reaffirms his commitment, which leads Bowdoin to ask how many warriors Ambroise could guarantee. And here's where we run into the struggle of Indigenous diplomacy being radically different from colonial governance in important ways. And Ambroise informs Bowdoin that it is not in our power to answer for the whole of our tribes. So what he makes clear is that the delegates from this meeting are going to have to return to their homelands. They're going to have to hold discussions with their kin. Every family band is going to have to agree. He makes it clear that some aren't even aware that this meeting is happening. Some are away hunting. It could take months, if not longer, to come up with an actual answer. And this kind of thinking is foreign to most European officials. But in a region where Indigenous nations retained power and sovereignty, there was no way around it. So the treaty the two sides struck was about an alliance and not about a surrender. The colonies and the Indigenous Nations shall henceforth, this is what the treaty says, shall henceforth be at peace with each other and be considered as friends and brothers, united and allied together for their mutual defense, safety, and happiness. And as the theater of war turned to the southern colonies at the end of the decade, this northeastern borderland remained a contested space in which Indigenous nations held the balance of power between British forces and patriot settlers. So the war happens, turns out okay for the patriots. They strike a peace, and after that peace, they have to figure out what they're going to do with this victory. 1783 sort of secures independence and a loose alliance of independent colonies, but it's not yet a nation. And so they have to think about ways that they can become a nation. And they turn to, ultimately, geography as a tool for creating a national identity. And so here I want to talk about Jedediah Morse, another Yalie who looks like that. Morse was the son of a Connecticut Congregationalist deacon. He graduated from Yale in 1783, just as Great Britain and the United States were finalizing their peace. In 1784, he finds himself teaching at an all-girls school in New Haven, and he doesn't have a suitable textbook to teach them geography, so he decides that he will just make one. He writes Geography Made Easy, which was intended for students, dealing with Connecticut's transition from imperial colony to independent state. Like many geographers, Morse hoped that maps and a sense of place would inspire students and citizens to believe in a political project. There was not yet a true nation of the United States in 1784, but Morse's efforts helped Americans from these independent states think more clearly about how they were connected and what might be useful for crafting a national character. In 1784, Stiles publishes another textbook, this one called Geography Made Easy. This is an instructional textbook, and it comes with this sort of frontispiece of a map, and it's Amos Doolittle's Map of the United States of America. And here's another moment where maps are tricky. This is not the United States of America. This map includes Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Canada, indigenous homelands. The coloring is not equal. You cannot tell where one nation's borders begin and another ends, and in part this is because Americans had not yet given up on this idea of a truly continental nation. In 1789, Morse updates his textbook again. This is a classic trick that is used to this day. Just publish new editions, allow more money to come in. The 1789 book, The American Geography, receives high praise from no less than Washington himself, who says the book will encourage a better understanding between the remote citizens of our states. And to read this book, you do take a tour of the American states, but he also includes British provinces, although they get smaller sections than the states themselves. And Vermont's kind of in the middle. It hasn't decided what it's doing yet. Its entry's longer than the British colonies, but not as long as the American states. And he discusses Quebec. And in his discussion of Quebec, he uses the kinds of terms that people like me hear all the time. Canada is frozen. It's barren. It's very far away. There's not a whole lot of people there. He's also able to emphasize that there's no assembly. It's run by a military government. It's very different than the United States. And for him, this is important. He wants his readers to realize that you can craft an identity by figuring out what you are not. In 1793, another textbook comes out, another edition, this one called The American Universal Geography, which says right on its title page, calculated for Americans, but its organization had changed. This time, readers had to take a tour through the British provinces first, before they got to the American states. And Morse's interpretation of those British provinces had also changed. What he was able to recognize and what is depicted here in a map that shows up in a slightly later version is that the British colonies had been reorganized. So Quebec had been divided in 1791 into Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Both provinces had been given an assembly. So he's not able to say that this is just a military government anymore. Nova Scotia had been split between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, again to kind of increase the democratic feeling in those places. He even changes his mind about how cold and barren Quebec is. He describes Montreal, yes, as cold, but then he says, cold, they're really healthy. The cold seems to do something for their immune systems. And it's actually really easy to get around in the snow. With a horse and a sleigh, it can be quite pleasurable. And he almost seems to like the British version of Canada more than he likes the American version of the South. He is a federalist, and he sees in the British provinces really what patriots had hoped to do originally in their revolution, was simply to secure the rights of British subjects. So he's aware that loyalists who had fled the revolution pushed for changes and got those changes. And so now his readers, again, have to be aware of how places outside of the United States can change and adapt, and what that means for understanding their place in the United States. So I'll finish just with the War of 1812 as a continuation of the Revolution. And there's a lot of maps of the War of 1812, but they're not all that interesting. And then I stumbled across this board game, which I've never played, and I'm not exactly sure what the point is, but it does say Invasion of Canada and Birth of America at the bottom. So putting these two things together. And I assume the goal of the game is to capture Canada finally. I don't see how you can win because that didn't happen. I'll try to get a copy and see what actually happens here. But in late 1812, after the United States had declared war against Great Britain, which was a complicated process, and suffered early defeats in this war at the hands of the British and the French Canadians and Indigenous forces, there appeared a pamphlet in New York satirizing the Republican obsession with taking Canada. So I said the revolution kind of started with the goal to invade Canada and get it. The War of 1812 is seen as sort of the last opportunity to do this. And so this pamphlet is called The War of the Gulls, a Historical Romance. And it opens with James Madison, drunk on mint juleps, sitting in his room in Montpellier, gazing at a map of British America. The map has been filled in with fictional future American successes. There is an American viceroy of Labrador, there is a collector of customs along the Mackenzie River, and a military general controlling what is left of Quebec. And Madison flops back in his chair and muses, "Who can, like me, put his thumb on a whole continent at once?" So this narrative, this satirical narrative, continues by describing the ease with which naval commanders control all of their ships that don't actually exist, how Republican newspapers transform every American loss at sea into an impressive victory. There's a story about how easily the American forces slaughtered a group of sheep that they found in British North America. And there's another story that's a success story at how successfully the Republicans retreated from an invasion. They didn't lose a single person in their retreat. And so this is sort of making fun of this Republican view. But the central question remains, how are we actually going to take Canada? And so Madison, in this pamphlet, receives a flurry of suggestions. They include placing the god of war in the stomach of a wooden horse and sending it into the heart of Quebec. They could also just dry up the St. Lawrence River and march across it. Or, if you're willing to put in a little bit more work, march a fleet of ships across the continent to the Columbia River and then descend, surprising them from the west. Madison, however, was resolved to take Canada by proclamation. The government then decides that for the sake of appearances, the proclamation should at least be attended by a regiment or two. And here this resonates. The one story that Canadians always get about the War of 1812 is that Thomas Jefferson said famously that taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching. And so this pamphlet is kind of playing up on this idea. But whether to declare war and how to proceed if a war began remain central topics of debate in early June of 1812. These discussions often revolved around Canada's relations with the various Indigenous nations that would inevitably be pulled into the conflict. As the House and Senate deliberated and then passed a declaration of war, officials received letters and newspapers issued editorials expressing their concerns. There were certainly balances of power to consider. While the United States clearly wanted to strengthen its position relative to Great Britain, other dynamics also required attention. An anonymous correspondent urged President Madison to consider the relative value of Canada. By the conquest of Canada, you may injure the commerce of England, but the object will cost more than it was worth. And the conclusion of the War of 1812 did not sever ties between British subjects and American citizens, but it did both mark an end and a beginning. The elite in Upper Canada still felt an affinity for New England Federalists, and vice versa. The Six Nations Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous peoples maintained and maintain transnational communities, and blacks in Canada and United States, in various forms of freedom and unfreedom, worked to build relations across a border that represented much more than a national dividing line. For many of these people, however, the border did become increasingly national. Family members could live on either side, ideas could move across with relative ease, and commerce, both legal and illegal, persisted. But citizens of the United States now had to accept that the British provinces would never become American states, not by war, not by will, and not by wishing. Neither a threat nor an ambition, the regions north of America, British colonies, and then after 1867, Canadian provinces, developed in parallel to the Republic to the south, an example of the path not taken, and a constant reminder that the failure to incorporate Canada during the Age of Revolutions shaped the creation of the United States. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that. He's agreed to take some questions. What we'd like to do, as we normally do, if you have a question, please raise your hand. One of the TAs will come with a microphone so everyone can hear the question as well as Professor Lennox's response. Please just tell him your name, what you're studying if you're a student, and then ask your question, and we will go until 1 p.m. We know some of you may need to leave before then for a 1 o'clock class. If you need to do that, please just do so as quietly as you can. Okay, so anyway, thank you. Questions?
My name is Hannah, and I'm pre-med here at BYU, and I'm living with 4 Canadians.
Oh, congratulations.
And this is a tangential question to your lecture, but you're Canadian.
Yes.
So do you think that, like, the American misunderstanding of what Canada is has been intentional from the start? Because you mentioned that, like, even in the beginning, we were talking about, like, there's no people in Canada. And I didn't know that Alberta was a place until 6 months ago. And so, like a place of people. And
Sure.
so do you think that this has been, like, an intentional thing?
That's great. And don't feel bad. I mean, I have students from New York who, I have to explain to them, Montreal's 5 hours away. Was it? No, I don't think that it was intentional. And in fact, I think sort of in the bigger project, one of my arguments is that in the 18th and early 19th century, Americans were much more aware of what was happening in Canada, right? When America was weak, this is the challenge I think that we have, is understanding that in the 1780s and 1790s, the rest of the world didn't take America terribly seriously. It wasn't a military force, it wasn't a very strong diplomatic place, it didn't have a great reputation in terms of treatment of indigenous peoples and the enslaved. So it had to work really hard at developing international relations, and it sort of cut its teeth on those international relations with indigenous diplomacy, right? Striking treaties with indigenous nations. But I think they actually knew a whole lot more, and I think that's why the Morse textbooks are important. The other thing that I'll put up sometimes is sort of the typical map of America where there's nothing above it. And that's the same if you get a typical educational map of Canada, right? It's just sort of a straight line and the outline of the Great Lakes and then nothing. So I think what's happened is there's been a reversal over time as the United States just grew into a global superpower and didn't have to really concern itself with what was to the north. It just didn't. Canadians, ironically, also don't know a whole lot about their history, but they can tell you about the United States. because we grew up with your TV and your radio and your musicians. So it is, I think, it's a story of what makes citizenship and what helps people understand their identity in a place. And we kind of now have, unfortunately, in most nations, we sort of think of ourselves as the center of the universe. But I think the interesting thing is in the 18th century, that wasn't the case for Americans. They were very aware of what was happening elsewhere. Well, thanks for that question.
This question was asked by Kate, who's watching on Zoom. She asked, through your presentation, it seems apparent that these maps used in the 18th century were more than just maps. Instead, they gave imperial messages. In contrast, maps today seem rather objective. My question is, what would you say are the equivalents, if there are any, of those maps in today's culture and media?
That's great. Fantastic question. Don't think of maps as objective. That's the challenge. Maps put value on everything, right? You open up Google Maps now, and certain places pay to be on there, and certain places don't pay to be on there. If you want to find, the highest rated restaurant, and if it has a sponsorship deal, it's there. Maps always make arguments. I think the challenge is, even in the 18th century, the people making these maps thought they were being objective, right? This is the era of the Enlightenment. They're using science. The maps usually have stuff written on them saying, from the most recent surveys, right? That's the selling point. But if you look at a British map of North America and a French map of North America, you will see that they have radically different ideas of what places are. And Nova Scotia, which is over here on this map, not on that one, is a great example. France and Britain fought over who owned or could control Nova Scotia for most of the 18th century. They had different names for it. The French called it Acadia. The British called it Nova Scotia. The French went so far as to argue that Nova Scotia was a word in the air, was not a place. And while this is all happening, they're largely ignoring the indigenous reality of that it's not Acadia or Nova Scotia, it's Mi'kmaqi. Only the Mi'kmaq can go wherever they want in Nova Scotia without being worried of being killed. British settlers didn't want to leave their forts. The French had a better relationship, but still had to be concerned. So maps, this idea of enlightened science and objectivity is tricky, and it's one of those things we have to be very careful with today, because as we know, throughout the world, borders are a very divisive argument, and a map can simply shift a border to where it wants it to be, and if we assume it's objective, then we're just buying an argument without being critical enough. So I think that's the lesson from the 18th century. This is how we need to look at maps and geography as sort of imperial, colonial tools.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Pike, I'm affiliate faculty with American Studies and work full-time for the Wheatley Institute here on campus. My question is one that has been percolating since my time as an undergrad, and it has to do with the 1783 Treaty of Paris. And apparently John Jay was very upset with Franklin for losing Canada. Mm-hmm. There was a map that had been sent to them that showed the United States gaining much of Canada. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, Franklin kind of just threw it away in some fashion, according to John Jay. Mm-hmm. And I've thought that, and I really was grateful for your assertion of the Catholic aspect mm-hmm. of this, and how much do you think that has been maintained in relation to the character of the United States as a Protestant mm-hmm.
nation,
and then the way in which Franklin himself was aware of the differences of legal, political thought. I study theology and political thought, mm-hmm. and that bleeds into religion and politics as well. But this idea of, we can't have, what would the nation, the character of the nation be if we had a large Catholic province join the states?
Sure.
How would that change the nature of U.S. history, but also just the vision that they had at that time for mm-hmm. what they were building?
That's great. Thank you. I wish I had more time to talk about Franklin, who was obsessed with Canada. He, Franklin the American, the pictures of him with his marten fur hat, he got that on a trip to Montreal in 1776 when he's trying to convince the Canadians to join the Patriot cause. After the failed invasion. They did diplomacy backwards. They did war first, and then they sent Franklin up. So Franklin actually, he doesn't give it up. What happens at the negotiations is Franklin, he's got gout, and he argues to the point where his counterpart in the British emissary keeps a really good diary, and he has things like, "Oh, Franklin keeps bringing up Canada again, and we're not going to give it to him, but they have to string him along." And what happens is Franklin gets sick, leaves the negotiations, and Jay and Adams just sort of put it all together. But the Catholic question is great, because when Franklin is in Montreal in April of '76, he goes up with Charles Carroll of Carrollton and John Carroll. John Carroll's a Catholic priest. They're both Catholics. And John Carroll's job, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton's job, is to convince the Catholics that they'll be fine in the United States. Right? They say, we're Catholic, we're from Maryland, there are Catholics here, we will also protect your faith. Language, we'll talk, but like faith will be fine. The problem that they have is at the same time, there's a whole bunch of Catholics who have been run out of New York, who are in Montreal, who can say, that's actually not true. You're not that friendly to Catholics. And so I think the French Canadians were not going to join the United. There's always a small contingent well into the 19th and 20th century of French Catholics who think like, maybe we'll have a better chance because states have all these rights in the United States. Maybe we could align ourselves that way. But the French Catholics were, they were happy with the British. The British had given them the Quebec Act. They let them have their language. They let them have their laws. And the British had done a really good job of winning over the Catholic sort of higher church authorities. And so in 1776, the bishops issued these amendments, I think they're called, which basically said, if you side with the patriots, we're going to excommunicate you. We need to put in our lot with the British who have protected our Catholicism. So the Catholic thing is a big issue. And then the other one is the South has a challenge because if Quebec joins, this also comes up in the War of 1812, it's a non-slave state, so it would overthrow the balance that they're trying to maintain. So religion and the institution of slavery and language all sort of complicate those things. But Franklin is all in for, as the final treaty is crossing the Atlantic to be signed, he's coming up with things like, maybe we can just put in that they don't have to join us, but they have to be independent. So Quebec will be independent, Nova Scotia will be independent, and then obviously they'll join afterwards. He never gives up on it, in part because he believes in this continental idea, in part because he is a land speculator in Nova Scotia, and he wants to benefit from that. So he's kind of got all kinds of strategies happening. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that really fell in. Adams was really focused on the fishery. That was his, he wanted to make sure that they would maintain access to Newfoundland and the cod fishery. I'd have to double check how much it came through, but it didn't come out in reading the records. Yeah, thank you.
So my name is Michael. I'm a history major here. You talked a little bit about how the map makers reacted to things like the Quebec Act and the war. What are the ways that they influence? Because I'm guessing the government utilized these map makers to, obviously draw the map of where it is. But how did they and their maps influence these same acts that you were talking about, how they reacted to?
Yeah, great question. So part of the challenge is that the institutions for making maps are radically different in Britain and France. France, it's wholly institutionalized. They have a department that's in charge of mapping overseas possessions, and those people are paid to do it. In the UK, it's sort of freelance. So people who are making maps are also producing prints of birds and landscapes to sell. So it does come out in boundary commissions, which stymie the peace process for a while, in part because they want the boundary that separates the British provinces from the American states to be at the head of the Mississippi River, but then they realize the Mississippi River doesn't actually meet where they think it meets, so they're just wrong. The boundary between Maine and New Brunswick isn't settled into the 19th century because they actually can't find the river that they have defined as the boundary. There's 3 St. Croix rivers that they're sort of competing between which river is the true river. So they're playing a really instrumental role, but the stuff that they're producing, it's just not, as much as I'm saying it's never exact, it's not even exact enough to get these boundaries right. But what it does do is it influences imperial sentiment. So both the French map makers and the British map makers have a big public influence because they will publish a map and they will say, this is what New France is, and this is what they want New France to look like. And so that riles up the public, which is really important if you're going to launch a war, right? You need at least that sort of stamp of approval from the public. So it's not a straight relationship, but what they're doing is certainly influencing both the political realm and the sort of public support that they need.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time now. Please join me one more time.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.